Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge Toronto as a sacred gathering place for the many Indigenous people of Turtle Island. We also wish to recognize the long history of First Nations and Métis people and show respect today to the Mississaugas of New Credit. A little more than a year ago, I stood in this very spot as we announced an inquiry into systemic racism and racial profiling in policing by the Toronto Police Service. Since that time, we have made significant progress in our inquiry. And just as we promised a year ago, today we are reporting publicly on our progress to date. We have chosen a special day for this interim release, as December 10th is the 70th anniversary of the day that the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's an excellent day for thinking about the progress made in Ontario, as well as the challenges we still face 7 decades later. I now invite Renu Mandani, Chief Commissioner of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, to provide more details on the interim report we are launching today, entitled A Collective Impact. I will then invite several speakers to offer their remarks from various community perspectives. Then I will invite all of our speakers to join us for questions from the media. Chief Commissioner.
Good morning. Thank you to the media and our community members who have joined us here to mark International Human Rights Day. As Alicia mentioned, on this day, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in 1961, the Ontario Human Rights Code was introduced in the legislature to make the rights protected in the Universal Declaration a reality. From the beginning, the Ontario Human Rights Commission has actively worked to end racial profiling. 15 years ago today, we released Paying the Price, our inquiry into the lived experience of racial profiling in Ontario. And today, we launch A Collective Impact, the Commission's interim report on its inquiry into racial profiling and racial discrimination of Black persons by the Toronto Police Service. This inquiry is different from past initiatives. We will examine racial disparities in how police services are provided in Toronto and marry this hard data with lived experience and case law. The goal of our inquiry is to build trust in law enforcement and make our communities safer. Because when diverse communities trust the police, they see themselves as allies of law enforcement rather than targets. Each person in Toronto, regardless of their race or the neighborhood they live in, should be able to go about their daily life free from discrimination and harassment. The essence of freedom is being able to fulfill our full potential and contribute to society. Racial discrimination is an affront to freedom. A collective impact includes analysis of quantitative data obtained from the Special Investigations Unit. It includes a review of SIU directors' reports, which have never before been released to the public. It highlights legal decisions that have found discrimination against Black persons by the Toronto Police. A collective impact summarizes our engagement with about 130 Black people across the city. This interim report is the latest in a body of reports, findings, and recommendations over the past 30 years that point to persistent concerns about anti-Black racism in policing in Toronto. Our interim findings are disturbing and call for immediate action. The data analyzed by Dr. Scott Wortley confirms that Black people in Toronto are far more likely to have police use force against them that results in serious injury or death. Between 2013 and 2017, a Black person was nearly 20 times more likely than a white person to be involved in a fatal shooting by the Toronto police. Despite representing only 8.8% of Toronto's population, Black people make up approximately 30% of police use of force cases that result in serious injury or death, 60% of deadly encounters with Toronto police, and 70% of fatal police shootings. During this same period, Black men were complainants in a quarter of SIU cases alleging sexual assault by Toronto police officers. The SIU director's reports reveal instances where there was a lack of legal basis for police stopping Black civilians in the first place, inappropriate searches, and unnecessary charges and arrests. The reports also raise broader concerns about officer misconduct, transparency, and accountability. The courts and oversight bodies have found incidents where officers provided biased and untrustworthy testimony, inappropriately tried to stop the recording of events, and failed to cooperate with the SIU. The data proves that Black people are overrepresented in police use of force cases that result in serious injury and death. And this situation hasn't changed since the early 2000s. We can only truly understand the meaning and impact of this data by listening to and accepting the lived realities of Black communities. For example, in 2013, an SIU director's report found that a Black man was stopped by Tavis officers. The officers held each of the man's arms and asked him whether he had anything on him. After he replied in the negative, an officer pulled down his shorts and underpants, leaving his genitals exposed to the public. The officers then laughed at him. The SIU director found that this strip search was unnecessary. The Commission learned more by speaking directly with Black people about their experiences with the Toronto police. We heard firsthand about the resulting fear, trauma, humiliation, mistrust, and expectations of negative treatment. And we heard about the damage that one person's negative experience can have on the entire community. For example, one person told us, and I quote, "The DeFonte Miller matter affects everyone in the community because it's so egregious and it was hidden. It's a collective experience. It's a collective impact." The next phase of the Commission's inquiry will analyze lower-level use of force incidents, carding, charges and arrests, and conditions and forms of release. 30 years of reports and recommendations tell us that data collection is the foundation to combat racial discrimination in law enforcement. That's why data is currently collected in the United States and the United Kingdom. Yet, the Commission's work is necessary because the Toronto Police Service does not consistently collect race-based data, and the board has never required them to do so. The Commission will also examine police culture, training, policies, procedures, and accountability mechanisms. We will hear from police leaders, frontline officers, associations, and organizations, and we will continue to learn from Black communities about their firsthand experiences. All of this work will lead to a final inquiry report with findings, recommendations, and next steps. The Commission recognizes that policing is vital to public safety and that it is a challenging and sometimes traumatic profession. We also know that the Toronto Police have a stated commitment to building trust with diverse communities to make us all safer. But trust cannot be built without first addressing persistent concerns about racial profiling and racial discrimination. The Ontario Human Rights Commission's findings in a collective impact are disturbing, and they demand an explanation. At this interim stage, we are calling on the Toronto Police to acknowledge the Commission's very serious human rights concerns. We're calling on the Board to mandate the collection and public release of race-based data. We're calling on the City of Toronto to implement the Toronto Action Plan to confront anti-Black racism. And we're calling on the Government of Ontario to continue its ongoing efforts to strengthen police oversight. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. The OHRC retained Dr. Scott Wortley to analyze the Special Investigations Unit data involving the Toronto Police Service. He is an associate professor at the University of Toronto's Centre for Criminology and Sociological Studies. He has expertise in racial profiling and social science methodology. Dr. Wortley will describe his methodology and key findings. Dr. Wortley?
Thank you, Alicia. I have to put these glasses on. When I first started analyzing these issues, I didn't require glasses. Now I do. Sorry, this is... I analyzed SIU data involving the Toronto Police Service from 2 time periods, January 1st, 2000 to June 6, 2006, and January 1st, 2013 to June 30th, 2017. I'll refer to them as time period 1 and time period 2. The data was collected from SIU case files. It had to be coded, meaning that it had to be manually entered from case file materials into a unique or an original data set. There is no existing data set that we could draw upon. The 2000 to 2006 data was previously collected and coded as part of the Ipperwash inquiry. This is the first time, however, it's a new analysis of data exclusive to the TPS. When we released before, it was GTA police services. The 2013 to 2017 data was collected and coded by the OHRC as part of this inquiry. So it's original and new data. From 2000 to 2006 and 2000 to 2017, much of the information gathered was from SIU directors' reports, which provide detailed information on each SIU investigation. During both time periods, the SIU did not provide case information on ongoing investigations or cases that were where subject officers were before the courts. In total, I analyzed 187 completed investigations from time period 1 and 244 completed investigations from time period 2. How was race determined? The SIU does not regularly collect race-based data. In the majority of cases from time period 2, race was determined by examining SIU investigator notes and various TPS documents. What are some of the major findings? Are Black people more likely to have force used against them by the TPS that results in serious injury or death? Over 10 years ago, during time period 1, the answer was yes. Between 2013 and 2017, the answer is still yes. The more serious the police conduct and lethal the outcome, the greater the overrepresentation of Black people in the SIU statistics. In 2016, Black people made up approximately 8.8% of Toronto's population. However, from 2013 to 2017, they made up 28.8% of police use of force cases that resulted in serious injury or death, 36% of police shootings that resulted in serious injury or death, 61.5% of police use of force cases that resulted in civilian death, and 70% of police shootings that resulted in civilian death. These are gross overrepresentation. This is a gross overrepresentation in these various outcomes. Another way of looking at it, when we compare rates, SIU rates, a Black person was 3.6 times more likely than a white person to be involved in a police use of force case that resulted in civilian injury or death, 4.9 times more likely than a white person to be involved in a police shooting that resulted in injury or death, 11.3 times more likely than a white person to be involved in police use of force case that resulted in death, and 19.5 times more likely than a white person to be involved in a police shooting that resulted in civilian death. These, once again, are serious racial disparities. We also considered certain intersectionalities. For example, the rates of use of force are much higher for black males than black females. And black males were significantly also overrepresented as complainants in sexual assault investigations. They represent only 4.1% of the Toronto population, but were complainants in 25% of all SIU sexual assault investigations. White and black people appear to be overrepresented in SIU use of force cases where the civilian was exhibiting mental health issues at the time of the incident. Black people make up, as I said, 8.8% of the Toronto population, but represented 16.2% of use of force cases in which a mental health issue was noted. White people make up 48.4% of the Toronto population, but 65% of use of force cases in which a mental health issue was noted. I should stress that cases involving white civilians were more likely to cite a mental health issue than cases involving black civilians. In 43.6% of all cases involving white civilians, mental health was noted, compared to only 16.7% of cases involving black civilians. The majority of SIU use of force cases did not involve a weapon. In fact, from 2013 to 2017, most civilians who were involved in police use of force were unarmed. At the time of their encounter, black people, 66.7%, were slightly more likely to be without a weapon of any kind than white people, 63.6%. Incidentally, these figures are all found in the various tables in the report. A higher proportion of black people had a gun, 8.3% of black people versus 3.6% of white people, or a knife, 16.7% of black people versus 14.7% of white people in police use of force cases. However, in police shootings, a higher proportion of white people had a gun, 20%, than black people, 11.1%. Although there were more allegations of black people resisting arrest than white people were more likely to have a criminal record, 54.5% for white people versus 44.4% for black. And white people in these incidents were more likely to have allegedly threatened or physically attacked the police, 61.8% versus 44%. What about the outcomes of these investigations? During both time periods, very few SIU investigations resulted in criminal charges against the officers. TPS officers were cleared of criminal wrongdoing in over 90% of all SIU investigations during both time periods. Outcomes did not vary by race. Officers were just as likely to be cleared of criminal wrongdoing in cases involving white civilians as cases involving black civilians. Problems with TPS officer cooperation with the investigations were noted in about 9% of all SIU reports. Examples of lack of cooperation include failure to notify the SIU, delayed notification, or witness officers refusing to answer questions from SIU investigators. Problems with cooperation, once again, were about as likely when investigating a case involving a black civilian as a white civilian. In conclusion, I should stress that there's a great deal of analysis yet to be done on this data. Clearly, we've established that these gross disparities and disproportionalities exist. The next step in the analysis is going to try to explore the various explanations for these racial disparities. I should stress, however, that the size of these racial disparities in and of themselves justify serious research and policy attention. I don't think we can ignore these differences and sweep them under the table. In terms of future analysis, We plan to explore further patterns in use of force. We plan to, for instance, examine the difference between use of force incidents that stem from proactive police actions, like stop and search, or encounters on the street, as opposed to those in which the police are reacting to a call for service. We also want to do further analysis on age and gender differences, want to do further analysis with respect to mental health, socioeconomic status, and the geographic location of where these incidents took place. SIU cases, furthermore, only account for a very small percentage of total use of force cases. We plan to do an additional analysis of use of force incidents examining lower level use of force. And I'll open for questions afterwards. Thank you.
As the Chief Commissioner said earlier, it's important that the OHRC makes sure that the community has a strong voice in our work to eliminate racial profiling and racial discrimination. So we have invited 2 community leaders to share their thoughts on our interim findings and the effect on community. To begin, I would like to introduce Sam Tekel, who works with Success Beyond Limits. Mr. Tekel?
So thank you to the Commission and for the time and the space to speak. So my name is Sam Tekla, and I'm a community-based researcher, PhD candidate in sociology at York, and I work with Success Beyond Limits, which is based in Jane and Finch, tucked away in the northwest corner of this city. The young people with whom I am grateful to work grow up and attend school in Jane and Finch, and SBL, developed in 2010, is an organization that works to improve the educational outcomes, expand possibilities, and support youth in the Jane and Finch community along their individual paths to success, all doing so while keeping youth voice at the forefront of both SBL's motto and mandate. So this community and its set of demographic and structural factors are common across many communities in Toronto, which comes with the reality that our young people, their parents, the elders, and residents face an increased amount of policing and what many in the community would call over-policing. And to many communities like mine, racial profiling is at the heart of that over-policing. So for community, this report does not inaugurate any new learning. For in fact, this reality has long been documented. These are not, in fact, new times. The interim report findings do, and I quote, go some way towards explaining why trust between the TPS and Black communities remains fractured, despite decades of protests, reports, recommendations, and commitments related to anti-Black racism, end quote. It should be noted that in this interim report, protests comes first. Black and racialized communities have long been detailing the realities expressed in this report. What the Commission report does do is continue to validate the experiences and realities that are often absent. And while those of us who have been working on racial profiling in Toronto for some time might skeptically mark this report as just yet another in a long line, I firsthand saw the importance the focus groups and the community consultations conducted by the Commission played for the young people who were just beginning to have these types of interactions with police. This report confirms the realities of young people's lives in parts of the city that too often go unheard. Take, for example, one story where a young person in grade 10 described an incident when he was asked to step outside of class. He was greeted with 2 TPS officers waiting for him, and he was arrested and taken away. He was told he was being arrested for armed robbery and drug possession. While in custody, he said the police went to search his house and later realized it was a different person with the same facial structure. He told us he kept thinking about his mom. I quote him, how she was going to take it because I didn't do anything. She'd be stressing and crying. I got to my house and it was messy and I had to clean it myself, end quote. These stories of mistaken identity are common in the community. I hear these stories every day. These are commonplace. They are the everyday of young people living in communities like mine. Take another, a young man recounting to us his experience 4 years ago when he was around 14 years old. He was running around the neighborhood as part of a game he was playing with his friends when TPS officers stopped and arrested him. According to the individual, the officers thought he had a gun or had stolen something and was trying to run away. They stopped him, arrested him for allegedly having a gun and stealing, and eventually let him go. He says, they asked for my name and asked me why I was wearing all black. He was released after he explained he was playing a game with his friends. Again, to reiterate, these stories, compared to others we might recount, did not have a lethal end. Some do. As the report details, the long-standing concern of Black communities that are overrepresented in incidences of serious injury and deadly force involving the Toronto Police demonstrates that the more serious the police conduct and lethal outcome, the greater the overrepresentation. So when we're talking about excessive use of force or lethal ends, they're most likely Black or racialized. The stories I have chosen to recount above, they're ordinary, they're common, and they are what our young people go through on a daily basis. I have heard from Black youth with whom I work that when they set out to come to school in the morning and consider which way they'll go, or whether they'll walk in pairs or in a group, are all decided with police in mind. Do I feel like talking to police today? Do I want to be harassed, hassled, questioned? Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow either. These stories are everyday, they are common. This is the reality of the young people growing up in different pockets in this city. As does the Commission, I too have serious concerns about racial profiling and racial discrimination of Black people by the TPS in use of force incidences, stops, questions and searches and charges. Communities across Toronto echo the Commission's call for the police to hold themselves to higher standards and practices that might break with the histories that we've marked in this report, a history of distrust, over-policing, and hurt. And for those at the brunt of these kind of experiences, these interactions stay with young people, their families, and their communities. These interactions are not singular or individual. Whole communities are affected and will continue to be unless this interim report and these people and their realities are taken with the utmost gravity. The challenge is an open one. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, for sharing those stories. I now invite Valerie Steele with the Black Action Defense Committee to add a historical perspective and her thoughts on today's findings. Ms. Steele?
Thank you, Alicia. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, Renu Mandani, Chief Commissioner, and her team for this interim report on their inquiry into racial profiling and racial discrimination of Black persons by the Toronto Police Service. Today, December the 10th, 2018, International Human Rights Day, it is totally disheartening that we are still discussing the violence of anti-Black racism. This report is definitely not news to the Black community. It informs the wider community in Ontario that we in the Black community live this abuse and brutality on a daily basis. The history of police violence against the Black community is a sordid one. The Black Action Defense Committee was formed when Buddy Evans was shot on August the 9th, 1978. The murder of Albert Johnson on August the 26th, 1979, in his home galvanized the Black community because there was the realization that the police was behaving and operating as if they're in the southern United States. The Black Action Defense Committee is a volunteer, non-profit, community-based organization formalized in 1988 after the outrageous police shooting death of Lester Donaldson, an unarmed Black man with mental health issues in his rooming house, hiding behind a mattress. The incident further galvanized the community to action against racism and discrimination in the criminal justice system. It was formed particularly to advocate for police reforms and to provide support to families of victims of police shootings. It is very reasonable to say that things haven't changed. Have you ever witnessed a convoy of police cars that rained down on the Black community for the simplest of issues? Have you ever noticed on the streets of Toronto that the majority of the vehicles pulled over by police are Black drivers? Have you ever witnessed a young Black man with mental health issues having his leg broken after it was stepped on by a Toronto police officer because he was too tall? They couldn't get him in the car easily. Have you ever witnessed a young black youth being arrested and taken to the police station from school before his parents are contacted? Everyone likes to talk about anecdotal stories. These are not anecdotes. They are the lived experiences of daily life in the black community in Toronto for decades. During the 70s and 80s, the violence the black community experienced came from the police and the criminal justice system that sided with them. Instead of dealing with the attitudes and violence of Toronto police, the indifferent politicians began to study us. As a community, we have been studied to death. And all of those reports are sitting on shelves gathering dust and mud, and the black community continues to face the savagery of Toronto police. The Claire Lewis report of 1989 leads a long list of reports on the black community. If the findings of those reports had seen the light of day, we would not be mired in this abyss today. And if you read the report, you will notice that the treatment of black persons in our community have not changed. This report looks at the period 2010 to 2017. Through our lenses and the lived experiences of the black community, this is intergenerational anti-black racism. I didn't look this bad when I started this. I had black hair. The ugliness that continued exists in the black community is directly linked to strong anti-black racism in the criminal justice system led by the police. Over-policing, brutality, murder, over-representation in the prison industrial complex, racism, and specifically anti-black racism in every section of the justice system, all of that contributes to the designed failure of the black community. Whether you are a homeowner or a tenant, black people pay property taxes that pay the salaries and benefits of the Toronto police. It is egregious that we are actually paying these expenses to people who live in distant places to come to Toronto and disrespect and abuse us in the black community. We are an informed community. We are not stupid. The City of Toronto allowed the Toronto Police Association to run things for many years by bullying and threatening, and the results of that is a Toronto Police Service that supervises itself and does whatever it wants. Ontario provincial governments have allowed 25 years to pass before anyone looked at how policing is done in the province of Ontario. The former Liberal government had the courage to look at how policing is done and made significant changes in Bill 175, 2018, to give communities the kind of policing that is right for the 21st century. And this new government has put those implementations on hold. The overused word safety does not apply to the black community. The black community is most unsafe, and when we lift our voices in resistance, the politicians ignore our demand for action, thereby rendering us voiceless. We will never stop resisting injustice. We are not voiceless. We have taken our case to the United Nations, painting them the reality picture of life in Canada. The federal government has this information, and they too must act on it. Because we pay police officers salaries and benefits, the police actually work for us. They are supposed to do far better than they have been doing. Relationships can never be built on brutality. The black community must be treated better. We have been on the hamster wheel long enough. It is time. My advice to the younger black generation: You must continue to fight against the totally unacceptable policing that currently exists. Hold the various levels of government responsible for allowing our communities to be victimized by people our property tax dollars pay. The ugliness that currently exists in our community is designed, and we must push back hard on those who are complicit in the status quo. Many Black community icons have worked assiduously over the decades to make life better for the Black community. Akua Benjamin, Dudley Laws, Charles Roach, Sharona Hall, Denham Jolly, Hewitt Logue, Kingsley Gilliam, to name a few. Most of them have passed on, but you are here, and you must resist the status quo. Many of us are tired after decades of resistance and speaking truth to power. What is happening now has been happening for decades. It is wrong, it is racist, it must be stopped. The time has come. It is time. It is time. Thank you.
Yes.
Ms. Steele, I want to thank you for using your voice and for sharing your thoughts with us today. That wraps up the formal remarks for this morning. If you'd like more information on our work on criminal justice issues, check out our website at www.ohrc.on.ca or follow us on social media at @AuntHumanRights. If you're looking for additional reports, you can check in at the desk that you signed in at, and we have more reports for you there. I now ask Chief Commissioner Mandani and our guests to come to the front, and we'll open it up for some media questions. Thank you for joining us. Yeah. So what we're thinking is, if you can just say who you'd like the question to be pointed to, and then you can ask it to them. Awesome. Yeah.
Why is this happening?
Can you elaborate? Why is what happening?
What are your findings? There's discrimination. What is the basis of that?
So this is an analysis of two sort of complete data sets, the SIU data along with the case law that we've obtained and analyzed. It doesn't really answer the question of why. This is data that shows and proves disparities. But, you know, we believe that it requires a response from the Toronto Police. So I think it's up to them to explain why we see these disparities, and we look forward to hearing that explanation. Are you doing it, or? Sorry.
Yeah. Hi, Catherine McDonald from Global. What would ideally be the outcome you'd like to see from the Toronto Police?
So we, at this interim stage, have a number of recommendations that we've made. The first is simply to acknowledge the seriousness of our findings and to accept that they are serious and warrant further action. We're calling on the Toronto Police to immediately collect and release race-based data, and we're calling on the board to mandate the service to do that. We're calling on Ontario to implement Justice Tulloch's recommendations on police oversight, and finally on the City of Toronto to implement the recommendations in the Toronto Action Plan to confront anti-Black racism.
Hi, Philippe Demontier from Radio-Canada. So the police just responded via press release saying that they're open to, you know, having this discussion and whatnot. But how do you make sure that these recommendations that you're making have teeth, that they actually get implemented?
Thank you, and of course I welcome hearing further from the Toronto Police Service as to specific commitments that they are willing to make at this time. So the Commission's inquiry is ongoing. As mentioned by a number of the speakers, we've looked at serious injury and death, and we've looked at case law. We still want to analyze carding, and other stops and searches, along with lower level use of force incidents. And after that time, we'll be putting forward a more fulsome set of recommendations. And as people likely know, the Commission does have enforcement powers under the Human Rights Code. And obviously, we hope the police will adopt our recommendations now and at a later point, but we are also open to using the powers under the Human Rights Code.
Yeah. What triggered this study this time? Is it the Dafonte Miller case in December 2016, I believe?
So the Ontario Human Rights Commission has a very long history with the Toronto Police Service. And that dates back to a number of cases that were filed in the 2000s related to racial profiling, and that ultimately culminated in the Commission entering into a formal partnership with the Toronto Police Service over the number of years. That partnership lasted from 2007 to 2010. And after that, we saw insufficient progress on the recommendations we had made in 2010. And after the high-profile incidents, for example, involving Andrew Loku, Dafonte Miller, the incident involving the boys on Neptune 4, we decided that it was time to bring a quantitative approach to this problem and actually start to look into racial disparity data.
Yeah. To Madam Chief Commissioner and probably Scott Wortley, you have selected a number of official records for analysis. I note that coroner's jury recommendations were not among them. And I just wondered whether you had given that some thought and whether it's something that could be added to the mix, because over the last 3 decades, coroner's juries have made numerous recommendations about policing conduct and policing behavior which have not been implemented. And the jury, coroner's jury recommendation from the Andrew Loku inquest is the most comprehensive of them all. And so it would be good to include this among the data that you examined.
So we will be looking at coroner's inquest recommendations. The reason we haven't outlined them here is because they're publicly available, and so we don't need to use our inquiry powers to obtain them. But we've already started to analyze all of the recommendations made over the last 30 years to see areas that have been recommended to the police numerous times, and that will include looking at the Loku recommendations along with other coroner's inquests. I think that's sufficient for...
I have a sorry, go ahead.
What are your concerns about the politics behind this? Because as previously noted, the Liberal government had put changes into place. They've now been put on pause by the Ford government. What is your message to the Ford government over this? And what are your concerns about this being put on pause, about what might happen next politically?
So we had written to the new government shortly after they took office to encourage them to move forward with the reforms in the Safer Ontario Act. As I understand it, they are doing some more consultation, and they have formally responded to our report in a letter and indicated that they will consider our report as they revise or consider how to move forward with reforms. I think that our report is very consistent with Justice Tulloch's recommendations, and it really speaks to why we need to strengthen police oversight, including related to the SIU.
Are you concerned that it's going to be watered down by this new government?
Of course.
I think it'd be premature. We don't know what this new government's plans are, but certainly part of the reason we decided to release this complete data set related to the SIU was to inform the government as it starts to think about what aspects of Justice Tulloch's report to implement.
I have a question for Sam and Valerie. Thanks. I have a question for Sam and Valerie. You guys both mentioned that the findings of this type of report are nothing new for the community, that you've seen it before, and that, Sam, I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, you said something to the effect of you're hoping this isn't just another report. So from a community perspective, what has to happen going forward for this to be not just another report?
I don't know if I had used the language just another report. We as a community, there are lots of studies on us. If you went back to the Claire Lewis report in 1989, same old, same old. There's a long list of them. This is a good report in terms of making sure you keep this issue on the front burner. But it is something that we have been living with for a long time. And if you look in Denham Jolly's book, in My Black Life, the first page of that book talks about Denham as a 72-year-old man having a fender bender, and the police came to take charge even though he never had to take charge. And when he refused to get a tow truck, because the man already had CAA, when he refused to get a tow truck to tow the car because the car was perfectly normal and could go, you could drive it to a garage, the young police officer said to him, "What do I have to do to get you to comply? Put a gun to your head?" It's right here in the book, in the black. So I am saying to you, this is an everyday experience. This is not new. The final report won't be new. We live this every day, not specifically any one person, but it is the common thread that is sewn through the tapestry of the black community. Negativity from the police, disrespect, brutality, sometimes murder, and just plain intimidation. And for people coming from places where they have had negative encounters with the police, and to come and to sit and listen to us talk about our history with the Toronto police, things have to change, and we have to make sure that they change. And we thank Renew and her team for making certain that it remains on the front burner, because as I said before in my report, when we raise our voices to speak about what ails us, indifferent politicians render us voiceless, but we will never be voiceless.